The name was wrong. Dame Severin Olumerith had served the betrothal register of the Tideward Crown for 61 years, and in 61 years she had inked 412 names into its salt-cured pages, and not one of those names had made her drop a pen. The pen was dropping now. She watched it fall as if it belonged to someone else, watched it strike the lectern and roll, leaving a comet of blue-black ink across the open page where the 11 approved names of the season waited in her own perfect hand. Because Princess Anthe Ursuline, heir of the Tideward Crown, second-born and never meant for any of this, had just stood up before the assembled houses of Ilvara and the delegations of 4 river nations, and instead of speaking one of the 11 names on the slate, instead of Prince Cathral Dom of the Inland Compact, instead of any of the polished, vetted, catalogued sons of the great houses, she had said, in a clear voice that did not shake even slightly, Jos Merrick. The hall of the naming went silent the way deep water goes silent, not empty, pressurized. Severin knew every name on that slate the way she knew the bones of her own hands. There was no Jos Merrick among them. There was no Jos Merrick in the peerage rolls, the river registries, the delegation manifests. There was no House Merrick anywhere in the records of 300 years, because Jos Merrick was not Ilvari at all. Jos Merrick was the human who maintained the palace waterworks. She found him in the crowd before anyone else did, because she was trained to find the source of any disturbance to her right. He was standing at the back of the hall among the service stewards, where the working staff were permitted to watch the naming from behind the last colonnade. 26 years old by his guild file. Canvas jacket, guild gray, clean but mended at one cuff. Brown hair cut short and plain. He did not look astonished. That was the detail Severin's mind snagged on even as the hall began to come apart around her. He did not look astonished. He looked like a man who had been asked a question some hours ago and had given his answer and was now standing by it. He stepped out from behind the colonnade and stood where everyone could see him. The hall came apart. Prince Cathral Dom was on his feet first, and his voice carried the way money carries. This is a mockery of the season. Behind him the suitor benches erupted. 11 princes, 11 retinues, 11 houses that had spent fortunes on gifts and genealogies, all of them shouting at once. The Saltmarsh delegation stood. The Chancellor, Resauvain, was striding toward the dais with his robe of office swinging like a bell, and the Queen Marivelle Ursuline, who had buried a husband and a son in 3 years and ruled like a winter, had not moved at all. She sat on the tide throne with her hands folded and looked at her daughter the way you look at a wall that has just cracked. Mistress of Forms, the Chancellor's voice cut toward Severin. Rule on this now. Severin picked up her pen. Her hands knew what to do when the rest of her didn't. That was what 61 years bought you. She stepped to the front of the lectern, and the register's weight against her arms was the only steady thing in the room. The naming is spoken, she said, and her voice rolled flat and procedural over the noise, and the noise sank, because in Ilvara the forms were older than the houses, and everyone in that hall had been raised to go quiet when the forms spoke. The heir has named, the name is not on the slate. Then it is void, Cathral Dom said. Strike it and let her name again. It is not void. Severin heard herself say it and understood, with a sensation like stepping off a stair that wasn't there, that she was about to ruin her own year. Old Form 9, set down in the founding of the register. A name spoken at the naming is written in water before it is written in ink. It may be proved false. It may not be unspoken. He is a groundskeeper, the Chancellor said. He is an engineer of the Terran Waterworks Guild. Under contract to the Crown, Severin said, because precision was a reflex even when it helped no one. The form does not ask his trade. The form asks whether the heir spoke a name in the right in her own voice unforced. She did. I witnessed it. 400 others witnessed it. She let the silence sit one beat, the way you did when a ruling was going to hurt. The name stands until it fails. Fails what? Someone shouted from the benches. The season, Severin said. The same 5 stations every asked has stood for 300 years. If he fails them, the name is proved false and struck, and the heir names again from the slate. She turned, slowly, deliberately, and looked down the length of the hall at the young man in the gild-gray jacket, standing alone on the marble with 11 princes' worth of fury aimed at his back. If he passes them, the name is proved true, and the register takes it in ink. The Queen spoke for the first time, and her voice was quiet and carried to the walls. Mistress of Forms, you will conduct the vetting yourself. It was a punishment, and they both knew it. Severin bowed over the register until her forehead nearly touched the ruined page. Majesty. And Severin. The Queen's pale eyes were unreadable. Conduct it properly. By the book, every form, every standard, every mark. Whatever the book finds, the Crown will stand on. Which meant bury him. Bury him correctly so that no one can ever say the Crown cheated. And we will all pretend this never happened by the closing of the year. Severin bowed again. Around her, the hall was already turning. Heralds running for the river nation's couriers, house stewards whispering into the ears of their princes, the saltmarsh matriarch watching everything from her bench with her chin on her fist like a woman at a card table. And the heir, the impossible girl, Anthesis was standing on the dais with her shoulders square and her court gown hanging on her like a borrowed thing. Looking at the human across the whole length of the hall, he didn't bow to her. He inclined his head, the small flat nod of one worker acknowledging another across a job site, and Severin, who had catalogued 10,000 gestures of court in her life and could grade a bow to the degree, thought, "That is the most insolent thing I have ever seen." It took her 3 more days to understand it was the most honest. The waterworks of Leor Terrace ran under the palace like veins under skin. Severin had lived above them for 61 years and had been down into them twice, both times for funerals of lockkeepers, both times no further than the gallery of wheels. She went down the next morning with 2 clerks, a protocol case, and a list of 141 standards on which she fully intended to fail Joss Merrick by the end of the month. She found him inside the 3rd sluice with the gate dismantled around him like a butchered animal, bronze pieces laid out on oiled canvas in an order that was obviously exact and obviously not in any book. Water ran past him in the channel, fast and green-gray. He was up to his elbows in the guts of the machine, and a girl from the pump crews held a lamp for him, and he was saying, "So when she sticks at a quarter, don't force the wheel, you'll shear the key. You come down here and you clear the race first. The wheel's never the problem. The wheel just tells you where the problem is." "Master Merrick," one of Severin's clerks announced, the mistress of forms. He looked up, grease to the forearms, a smear of it on his jaw. He did not scramble, did not flush, did not perform. He said, "Ma'am, give me 1 minute, or the seal sets wrong and the 3rd runs dry on the laundries by noon." "The vetting of the ask," the clerk said icily, "takes precedence over laundry." "Not if you want clean shirts for it," Joss Merrick said, and went back into the machine. The clerk inhaled. Severin lifted one finger, and the clerk stopped. She stood on the walkway above the channel and watched the human work, and she did what she had been trained beyond all other training to do. She observed he worked fast and he never hurried. His hands moved the way court dancers' feet were supposed to and rarely did, no motion spent twice. He talked the whole time, but every word was for the lamp girl, instruction folded into action. This washer, that face up, feel for the seat there. When the seal went home, he turned the wheel himself, listened to it with his whole body the way a physician listens at a chest, and only when whatever he was listening for arrived did he straighten up, wipe his hands, and give Severin his attention entire. "Right," he said. "I know why you're here. Ask me anything." "That is not how a vetting begins," Severin said. "There are forms." "Then teach me the forms." He said it without irony. That stopped her for a moment. She had come down armed for either grovel or swagger, the 2 postures every unsuitable suitor in 3 centuries had brought to the register, and he had brought neither. "Very well." She opened the case. The clerks unfolded the field lectern with the ceremony of soldiers assembling a weapon, and she set the vetting book on it, and the runner of water filled the silence. "Joss Merrick. State your full name, your line, and your standing." "Joss Merrick. My father was Thomas Merrick, dock machinist, Rotterdam Tidal Authority, Earth. My mother is Ina Merrick, crane operator, retired. My line is 2 generations of people who keep water where it belongs." A beat. "My standing is journeyman engineer, Terran Waterworks Guild. 4th year of a 6-year crown contract. I look after every lock, sluice, gate, and pump from the palace reach down to the Saltmarsh Fork." "You have no house." "I rent a room over the chain store." The younger clerk made a strangled sound. Severin wrote, in the column reserved for lineage, in her smallest and most disciplined hand. "Claims 2 generations of competence in place of 300 years of blood." She intended it as condemnation. She would read it again, much later, and fail to make it condemn. "You understand what was done to you at the naming," she said. "You understand what the season will do to you. 11 houses will spend the next quarter year proving you unfit at 5 public stations, and the book I will judge you by was written to measure princes. No standard will be bent, no allowance will be made. The crown itself instructed me to conduct this properly, and properly means you fail." She regarded him over the lectern. "It is within the forms for the asked to decline before the first audience. There is no shame recorded against a name withdrawn. The heir names again from the slate, the year proceeds, and you keep your contract and your room over the chain store. I am required to offer you this once. I offer it now." The lamp girl was watching him. So was half the pump crew, Severin realized. They had drifted in along the gallery rails, silent, the way water rises. "Ma'am, can I ask you one thing first?" he said. "You may," when she spoke my name. He wiped his palms on the canvas, slow, careful, a man choosing his words with the same economy he'd used on the seal. "Did she look like somebody making a mistake?" Severin thought of the days, the borrowed-looking gown, the clear voice that hadn't shaken. The shoulders squared like a deckhands against weather. No, she admitted. Then I decline to decline, he said. Teach me the forms. I'll learn anything you put in front of me. And the things I can't learn in a quarter year, I'll fail honestly in front of everyone. But I'm not making her stand up there alone and unsay the only thing I've ever heard that court let her say for herself. He picked up his wrench, then set it down again as if remembering something. And ma'am, with respect to the book, measure whatever you like. I'm exactly what I told you I am. There's no padding in it, but there's no rot in it either. You won't catch me being anything else. Severin had spent her life around men who were taller when they spoke. This one stood the same height the whole time, and somehow that was the thing the room organized itself around. She saw the lamp girl looking at him with her ears tipped forward and the pump crew along the rail, gray uniforms, still as posts, and she understood that the first station hadn't been scheduled yet, and the vetting was already going wrong because the book had 141 standards and not a single one of them measured whatever this was. She closed the vetting book. The first audience is in 9 days, she said. Present yourself to my office at the 6th bell tomorrow. We begin with how to enter a room. I know how to enter a room. You know how to enter a pump gallery, Severin said. A throne room is a machine too, Master Merrick. Every part of it tells you where the problem is. You will learn to read it before it reads you. For the first time, something that wasn't gravity crossed his face, a short real flash of a grin there and gone, like sun off a wrench. Yes, ma'am, he said. She went back up the 400 steps to the daylight with her clerks behind her in scandalized silence, and at the top, where the noise of the water faded into the noise of the court, she stopped and looked back down the stairwell and made the first dishonest entry of her professional life. The form required her to record her preliminary assessment of the asked in one word. The traditional words were promising, adequate, doubtful, unfit. Severin wrote, undetermined. The Queen received her that evening in the chart room, where the maps of the flood country covered the walls floor to ceiling, every dike and lock and drowned village inked in generations of hands. Marivel Ursuline stood with her back to the door, looking at the southern floodplain, at the stretch of map where 3 years ago the river had come over the Edron dike and taken the Crown Prince and 1,900 subjects in a single night. They had renamed the dike after the dead heir. Ilvari grief worked that way. You wrote the loss into the infrastructure and went on. My daughter, the Queen said without turning, spent the night before the naming somewhere other than her chambers. Her maids covered it badly. Where was she? Majesty. I have not. You will find out. You are vetting the name, Severin. Vet how it came to be spoken. The Queen turned. Up close, she was gray at the temples, and the winter in her face had cracks in it that only someone trained in faces would find. Do you know what the houses are saying? That the girl panicked, that she seized on the nearest commoner the way a drowning woman seizes driftwood because she cannot face what she was never raised to carry. That the crown is now hostage to a child's stage fright and an old form no one had read in a century. A pause, except you. The form was on the page, Majesty. I did not put it there. No, you only refused to pretend it wasn't. Something moved behind the Queen's eyes that might, in a softer rain, have been humor. My husband used to say you were the only honest weapon in the building. Sit down. Savarin sat. The Queen poured 2 cups of stem tea herself, which was a signal of something, and stood holding hers without drinking it. I am going to tell you what I have told no one, and you will hold it under register seal, the Queen said. I cannot afford for this human to be destroyed slowly. The compact is circling. Catherall Dom's house holds the paper on half the lock trust and has spent 3 years letting the maintenance funds run dry while he buys drown. Land for the price of mud. He needs the marriage, or failing the marriage, he needs the crown humiliated and the season in chaos, because chaos suppresses land values and he is still buying. Every public station this human stumbles through is a week of chaos purchased free. She set the cup down untouched. So you will do this properly, Savarin, but you will do it fast. Fail him cleanly at the first audience if he is going to fail. Give the court its verdict and the year its peace. And if he does not fail cleanly, he is a groundskeeper, Severin. He is the man who maintains the thing your dynasty floats on, Severin said, and heard the words leave her and could not entirely account for them. The Queen's eyes came up slowly. 61 years of service sat in the room between them. 9 days, the Queen said at last. Teach him to enter a room. The heir came to Severin's office 2 days later, unannounced, alone, at an hour when the corridor lamps were being trimmed. Anthe Ursuline, 23 years old, heir by drowning, wearing not court dress but the plain field coat she had worn at the Low Terrace Academy, where she had been studying river science when the Edron dike broke and made her future a different thing. She stood in the doorway like a petitioner. You're vetting him, she said. I am vetting the name, Highness. It is not the same thing. It's exactly the same thing. She came in and sat, uninvited, which a princess could do, and put her hands flat on her knees like a girl bracing for a verdict. Ask me, whatever the register needs. Ask me and not the maids and not the kitchen roomer. Because the kitchen roomer has me either drugged, pregnant, or mad, and the truth is more embarrassing than any of those. Then I ask, Highness, where were you on the night before the naming? In the gallery of wheels, where I have been 100 nights since they recalled me. Her chin was up, her hands stayed flat. 3 years ago, they pulled me out of the academy and stood me in my brother's place. And every soul in this palace began performing at me. Do you know what that is, mistress of forms? The tutors performed patience. The houses performed devotion. The mirrors performed a princess. The only place in this entire building where no one performed was 400 steps down, where a human who didn't care what I was handed me a wrench and said, if you're going to stand there, hold this. Severin's pen had stopped. She made it move again. He put the heir to work. He put a student to work. He's the only one who noticed that's what I still was. The girl's eyes were sea glass green and dry and absolutely level. He taught me the locks, Dame Severin. The real ones, not the ceremony. He taught me what the city actually stands on. Gate by gate, every dawn before the court woke up and wanted me, he never once asked for anything. He never once told anyone. And when the histories of the drowning year came up, he didn't perform grief at me like the court does. He showed me the maintenance logs from the Edron Dike and said this didn't have to happen, and whoever taught you to rule should start there. She breathed once. Nobody taught me to rule, so he started there. And the naming? Severin kept her voice level. The night before, you asked him something. I asked him, if I speak a name they don't expect, will the man it belongs to stand? For the first time the level voice moved, a half tone only, the smallest water over the smallest stone. And he was quiet for a long time, and then he said, if you mean it, I'll stand. So I meant it. She stood up, and the field coat made her look at once younger and more certain than any gown had. They all think I panicked. Write this in your book, Mistress of Forms. It is the only thing I have done since my brother died that I planned. She stopped at the door. I know what they'll do to him at the stations, she said quietly. I've watched this court eat people my whole life. I am asking you for nothing except what you already gave him in the hall. The forms, exactly as written. He doesn't need the rules bent. A pause. And then, with a flicker of something fierce and young, he's good at machines. Then she was gone, and Severin sat for a long time with her pen in her hand, looking at the lineage column of the vetting book, at her own words. Claims 2 generations of competence in place of 300 years of blood. Below the palace, faint through the stone the way a pulse is faint through a wrist, she could feel the waterworks running. She turned to a fresh page and began, against every expectation she had carried down those 400 steps, to prepare the case file of Joss Merrick, the ast of the Tideward Crown, as if it were a case that could be won. He came to her office at the 6th bell every morning for 9 days, and Severin learned 3 things about humans that were in no Crown ethnography. The first was that they took notes. Not the decorative note-taking of young lords performing diligence. He wrote the way he worked, fast, exact, in a cramped engineer's hand, and on the 3rd morning when she tested him without warning on the precedence order of the river nations, he recited it back flawlessly and then asked her why the Saltmarsh Combine ranked below the Inland Compact when the Combine fed more people. She had opened her mouth to give the formal answer, which was 300 years old, and found she no longer entirely believed it. The second was that he learned rooms the way he claimed to. She walked him through the empty hall of audience on the 5th day, and he stood at the threshold a long moment, reading it, and then said, whoever runs this room wants you watching the throne. So the throne's not where the decisions happen. Decisions happen there. He nodded at the clerk's gallery, where the paper is. The throne's the wheel, ma'am. The gallery's the race. It was, give or take a metaphor, what it had taken Severin a decade of her girlhood to understand. The third thing was that he could not be made to perform, and this was going to destroy him, because the first audience was nothing else. She drilled him on the walk of approach, and he did it correctly, and it looked like a man crossing a machine shop. She drilled him on the triple bow, and he asked what each bow was for. And when she told him the second bow acknowledged the absent dead of the dynasty, he did that one beautifully, and the other 2 like a man checking under a sink. On the last evening, she sat him down across the lectern and said, you bow as if you mean only one of them. I do mean only one of them. At the audience, you will mean all 3 or the assessors will mark you. He was quiet a moment. Then mark me, he said, not defiant, just located, the way a wall is located. If I start meaning things I don't mean, she loses the one thing she picked me for. That's the whole engine of this, ma'am. I don't have blood, I don't have land, I can't dance. The only thing I bring to that hall is that every word out of me is load-bearing. The minute I fake one bow, Dom owns me, because then it's just a contest of who fakes better, and nobody outfakes a prince. Severin looked at him for a long time. 141 standards, and she could already fill in the marks. Deportment, doubtful. Reverence, deficient. Address, irregular. And under it all, unmarkable, the thing the book had no column for, the thing that had been bothering her for 9 days like a stone in a shoe. He was the only person attached to this season, herself included, who was not afraid. The form for the audience permits the asked one attendant of his own choosing, she said at last. A house son brings his sworn shield. Whom do you bring? Nobody. The crews are working the autumn drawdown. I'm not pulling anyone off the gates for theater. Then, catching something in her face, should I? It signals that someone stands behind you. Somebody does, he said. She'll be on the dais. Severin wrote attendant, declined, and for reasons she chose not to examine, drew a line under it. The first audience filled the hall of audience to the lamp rails. 11 princes attended in the gallery of the slate, dressed to a cost that would have re-bricked a dike apiece, and Cathral Dom sat at their center in compact blue with a falcon's patience. Because today he did not have to do anything at all. Today the machine would do it. The court assessors sat in their black rank with their tally boards. The queen took the tide throne. The heir sat below her in formal silver. And Severin, from the register's lectern, watched the girl find the human in the crowd the moment the doors opened and watched her not look at him. Again with a discipline that cost something visible. He made the walk of approach like a man crossing a machine shop. The assessor's styluses moved. He made the triple bow and meant one of them. The styluses moved again, and a ripple of dry amusement crossed the gallery of princes, and Severin's jaw set itself. The interrogation of the asked lasted 2 hours by the water clock. The forms allowed any sworn house to put questions, and they came like weather. His parentage answered plainly, dock machinist, crane operator, a murmur of theatrical pity from the benches. His holdings, a room over the chain store, open laughter now, and the heir's knuckles whitening on the arm of her chair, and the human standing in the answering square with his hands easy at his sides, taking it the way stone piers take wake. Lord Issen of the Delta asked, with surgical courtesy, whether the ass could read. The hall tittered. Jos Marek said, yes, my lord. Schematics, water tables, tide charts, contract law, and faces. And there was one beat where the hall did not titter, and Severin saw the Saltmarsh matriarch's chin come off her fist. Then Cathral Dom rose, unhurried, and the hall leaned in. I have no questions for the asked, he said, voice carrying easy and warm. Questions imply something to discover, and there is nothing here undiscovered. He is exactly what he appears, an honest workman, doubtless skilled with his hands. The pause was a scalpel, which I'm sure the Crown's plumbing appreciates. I rise only to ask the assessors to note the dignity of this house, that we sat through 2 hours of it without objection. The compact honors the forms. He spread his hands, gracious as rainfall, and sat back down to a low hum of approval, and Severin watched him do more damage in 40 words than 11 houses had done in 2 hours, because he had reclassified the man as beneath rivalry. The assessors bent to their boards. The master of ceremonies struck the floor for the recessional right, the throne party to withdraw first, then the gallery by precedence, the slow peeling away that every Ilvari child learned before their letters. That was when Jos Marek broke every remaining form of the day at once. He had gone still in the answering square in a way Severin had learned underground to recognize, the whole body listening, the physician at the chest. Then he turned his back on the throne. On the throne, the styluses leapt and crossed the hall fast, not running, a flat purposeful gait through the precedence lines as if they were chalk and not law, straight to the great ceremonial dais stair where the queen's party had risen and the heir had just set her foot on the first step. Stop, he said, not loud. It carried like a dropped tool. The queen's sworn shields had blades half out. The hall was on its feet, and the human was on one knee. Not in reverence, the styluses would record bitterly, but at the stair's footing, with his arm under the carved lip of the second step, palm flat against the underside like a man taking a pulse. Lance Warden, he said, to the nearest guard, conversational, urgent, get them off the stair. The bearer beam's gone under the second tread. It's been wet-rotted from the cistern overflow, and someone's painted over the staining. Step on the proud edge, and the whole flight shears toward the throne. For one suspended moment, nothing. The forms had no procedure for this. The queen stood 3 steps up with 1,900 drowned subjects and 1 drowned son behind her eyes, looking down at a human, kneeling in the wreckage of every protocol in the building, with his hand under her staircase. It was the lance warden who moved a young guard, Chiral, by his collar tabs, who had stood post in the gallery of wheels and knew the human by sight. He did not look to his captain. He looked at where Marek's hand was, and he turned and put his arm across the stair in front of his queen, which was itself a flogging offense in some reigns, and said, Majesty, please. They brought lamps. They brought the clerk of works, gray and stammering. Under the painted-over staining, the bearer beam crumbled at a knife's touch like wet bread, and the proud edge of the second tread sat a finger's width high. The detail, Severin realized, the human had read across 40 feet of hall during a recessional rite, the small wrongness in a surface he had walked past 9 days running with her drills in his ears. A day's stare that took the throne party's weight twice a year, at the first audience and at the closing. A flight that shears toward the throne. The court did what courts do. It converted terror to procedure within the hour. An inquiry was opened. The clerk of works was suspended. The chancellor's office issued a statement praising the vigilance of the crown's contracted staff, wording chosen with tweezers to make the ask back into the plumbing. But Severin stood at her lectern while the hall emptied and watched the pieces that would never appear in any statement. She watched Catherine Dom looking at the human with the falcon patience gone and something colder doing, inventory in its place. She watched the air on the safe stone of the dais, shaking very slightly now that no one needed her not to, watching the human pack away a borrowed lamp. And she watched Lance Warden Cairo at the door of the guard's stair, stop, turn, and salute Joss Marek. Not the half-courtesy owed an upper servant, but the full blade to brow of one professional to another, held a beat too long to be anything but meant. One, Severin thought, with a strange pressure under her ribs, and did not know yet that she had begun counting witnesses. The assessor's tallies arrived at the register that evening. Deportment, deficient, reverence, deficient, address, irregular. Conduct of the recessional, gross violation referred to the mistress of forms for ruling. By the arithmetic of the book, the asked had failed the first audience, and the name was one station from being struck. The ruling was hers alone. That was the architecture of her office. The assessors counted, but the register weighed. Severin sat with the tally sheets until the lamps burned low, and then she took up her pen and wrote the ruling that she knew, even as the ink went down, would be read aloud in every great house on the river by week's end. The forms of the audience exist to answer one question: whether the asked, under the eyes of the realm, conducts himself as one fit to stand beside the crown. The assessors find he failed the rite. The register finds the rite failed him. Between the second tread and the throne stood every form in the book, and they were rotten. And he was the only soul in the hall who looked. Conduct is hereby weighed against outcome, per Old Form 22, the form of the drowning exception. In peril of life, the deed is the courtesy. The violation is struck, the station is ruled, passed, first of 5, entered by my hand Severin Olu Maraeth, mistress of forms. She sat back. Somewhere below the floor the waterworks ran in the dark. One, she said aloud, to no one, and surprised herself by saying it the way the lance warden had saluted. The reply from the court came within 2 days, and it did not come at her. It came because Catherine Dom was a professional, at the funding of the autumn drawdown, a compact motion in the lock trust, dry as dust, deferring non-essential subsurface expenditure until the irregularities of the season were resolved. Severin read it 3 times before she understood it, and when she understood it, she went cold. The maintenance budget of the southern gates had just been chained to the vetting. Every week the human survived. The locks he kept alive would be starved a little grayer. And when something failed, as starved things fail, it would fail with his name on the contract. She found him at dusk on the 4th gate walkway, logbook open, doing exactly what the motion had defunded. The air was with him. They were not touching. They stood a wrench's length apart, his and hers, and the princess of the tideward crown held a caliper while the human read tolerances off a chain pin worn past its rating, and neither of them heard Severin come up. And for a moment she watched what the court had never once seen. The two of them at rest inside a shared competence, easy as old crewmates, his voice low. She stretched another hair since midsummer. That's the trust's economy for you. And the heir answering, not as a girl performing interest, but flat and grim as any foreman. Then we log it and we date it, and when they ask why, we show them the dates. We, Severin noted. The pronoun went down in her mind in the lineage column beside 2 generations of competence. Mistress of forms, the heir said, straightening, and there was a guarded thing in her face, caught out, and then, when Severin only opened her case and took out the compact motion, the guard fell away into something older and angrier as she read. He's defunding the gates to bait a failure, Anth said. He is defunding the gates, Severin said, because your naming made the slow strangling of the lock trust suddenly urgent. 3 years of starved budgets, Highness. The register sees the trust accounts. I checked the history this morning. It begins the season your brother's dike went down. She let that sit, watching the human, whose face had gone very still. Master Marek, you maintain these works. In your professional judgment, which I am now formally requesting under the vetting, what fails first? He didn't hesitate, and that was the most frightening part. Mothergate, he said. The great lock, everything else I can nurse by hand. The mother's lifting chains were due for proof testing 2 budgets ago, and the tumbler race hasn't been stripped since before my contract. She closes twice a year, and she carries the equinox tide on her back when she does. If the closing of the year comes in on a storm surge and the mother sticks. He looked out, downriver, where the lamps of the low terraces were coming on by the thousand, strung along the flood line like a sentence waiting to be read. Then it's the drowning year again, except this time it's the capital. The heir said quietly, and the 5th station of the season, the last one, the one that proves the name, is the closing of the year, Severin said. At the mother gate, with the full court assembled on the tide stage below the sill. The 3 of them stood in the blue dusk, with the river running an early winter gray beneath the walkway, and Severin felt the season assemble itself around them into its true shape. Not a courtship, not a scandal, but a long fuse, lit at the naming and burning in plain sight down the calendar toward the equinox. And every form in her book just so much paper laid along its path. Then we have 4 stations to make the realm see what it refuses to look at, she said. And only when both of them turned did she hear her own pronoun. The heir's face did something young and complicated. The human just nodded once, flat, crew to crew. Welcome aboard, ma'am, he said. The 2nd station was the grief station, and it nearly broke him, and not in any way the book had a column for. The form was ancient and simple. In the dying of the year, the ask accompanies the heir to the realm's grief. Whatever the realm grieves that season and stands it with her, because a consort who cannot carry the crown's sorrow has no business carrying its joy. For 300 years that had meant a temple, a wreath, a recitation. This year, by a calendar nobody could alter, the realm's grief had an anniversary. 3 years to the season since the Edron Dike went down, and the rebuilt villages of the southern floodplain held their remembering at Marin Shallows, where the water had come over in the dark and taken whole sleeping streets. 11 princes sent wreaths, 4 sent poets. Catherall Dom, who held paper on half the drowned acreage and was buying the rest, sent a delegation in mourning blue with a sculpted stone barge for the shrine, and the court circulars praised the magnificence of compact grief. The ask went in person with the heir in the rain. Severin rowed in the 2nd boat with her case and her book and 2 assessors, down the long gray reaches where the river ran braided through the rebuilt country, past dike walls with the high water line of the drowning year still scorched into them in tar. They marked it that way, the river people, so no one could ever argue the water down. And she watched the heir in the lead boat, watching the marks go by, and she watched the human watching the dikes. Not the marks, the dikes. His eyes went where a keeper's eyes go, to the toe lines and the seep stains and the slumped facings. And by the time Marin Shallows came up out of the rain mist, his face had the stillness she had learned to read as arithmetic. The village met the heir at the landing with the full courtesy of the forms, and the forms here were river forms, older and barer than the palace ones. A plank walk, a bell, the head woman of Marin Shallows standing at the shrine door in oiled wool, a woman named Olm with a face like the country, weathered flat and holding. Whatever Olm had lost in the drowning year was not written anywhere Severin had access to, and did not need to be. It was in the way the whole village arranged itself slightly around her, the way water arranges around a piling. The rite was set for evening. The court party was shown to the rebuilt grange to wait out the rain in dignity. Joss Merrick did not go to the grange. Severin, looking for him a half-hour later with an assessor's query, found him instead at the landward end of the village where the relief channel ran, the channel that was supposed to carry stormwater around Marin's Shallows and visibly, even to her eyes, didn't anymore, silted to half its throat with 3 years of trust economy. He had his coat off in the rain. He had borrowed a long-handled scoop from somebody's boat shed, and he was in the channel to his knees with 4 village men who had no idea who he was, clearing the throat of it sluice by sluice, because the same storm calendar that had brought the remembering was bringing the first winter surge behind it, and he had read the silt line the way he read everything, and had simply started. "The rite is in 3 hours, Severin said from the bank. Rain loud on her case. "You'll be filthy." "Yes," he said, and kept working. An assessor at her shoulder was already writing. She did not stop him. The book was the book. She had given her word to the Queen that the standards would not bend, and the standard for the grief station was solemnity, and the ask was shoveling mud. But she stayed on the bank under the register storm canopy, and she watched the thing happen that she was beginning to understand happened wherever this man stood long enough. First, the village men worked around him as around any pair of borrowed hands. Then one of them noticed the way he set a drain stone, and stopped doing it the worst way. Then a boy came down the bank with a question from the boat shed and stayed, and was given the scoop and a sentence of instruction, and grew an inch. By the second hour, there were 11 people in the channel, and the human was not visibly in charge of anything, and was unmistakably the reason the line moved, and an old man with rope-scared hands worked beside him in a silence that read, even from the bank, as company. The air came down at the second hour. Severin saw the village see her, the stiffening, the forms reaching for themselves, the head woman's daughter running for the bell, and then Severin saw the air take off her court cloak, hand it to her sworn shield, and step down into the channel beside the human in her field boots. And the stiffening went through the village again, and came out the other side as something else entirely. Nobody rang the bell. Olm herself came to the bank and stood by Severin under the dripping eave of the boat shed, arms folded, watching the air of the tideward crown pass drainstones down a line between a fisherman and a human engineer. 3 years ago, Olm said to the rain more than to Severin, the crown sent us a stone barge. The barge was from the compact head woman. The barge was from the man who bought my sister's drowned field for the price of a goat, Olm said, flat as her face. I know what it was from. She watched the channel a while. The human said something inaudible. The air laughed, short and real. The first laugh Severin had heard from her in 3 years of court. The line of workers rippled with it the way a crew does. That one, Olm said. The one they're saying she named by mistake. Look at his hands and tell me about mistakes, Severin looked. Across the channel, the human paused to reset the boy's grip on the scoop. 2 seconds. Done without breaking the rhythm of the line, the same fold of instruction into action she had seen in the third sluice on the first morning, and she heard herself say, with a candor that violated 4 standards of her own office. The book I judge him by was written for princes. Olm's eyes, pale river green, didn't move from the channel. We had a book here too, forms for the water, 300 years of them. Which days to open the gates, which prayers, which rope. My grandmother kept the book. She turned her head then and looked at Severin, and there was the drowning year in her face, tarred on like the high water line. The night the dike went, the book said we were safe. The book had been right for 300 years, and it was wrong once, and once was my whole street. So I'll tell you what we keep now, instead of the book, mistress of forms, and you can write it in yours. We keep whoever shows up in the rain. She walked down the bank into the wet and took a scoop herself, and the village closed around its head woman and its air and its human. And Severin stood under the canopy with 61 years of forms and was, for a moment, ashamed of her dry boots. 2, she thought, and then, watching Olm fall into the work beside them. No, 200. The right, when it came at dusk with the rain stopping, and it was nothing the court party in the Grange had prepared for, because the village had quietly rearranged it. The form called for the heir to lay the crown's wreath at the shrine and withdraw. Instead, Olm met the heir and the ass at the shrine door, both of them mud to the thigh, scrubbed at the boat shed pump into rough decency, and handed the heir not a wreath but the striker of the village bell. 1,900 names, Olm said. We ring once for each. The ringing takes the night. The crown has never stayed for the ringing. The crown is busy, and we have never blamed it. Her eyes passed over the court party, the assessors, the compact delegation in their mourning blue beside their stone barge, and came back to the heir, and her voice didn't change at all, which is what made it terrible. Stay or go, Highness, the bell doesn't mind, but the one who rings the first name stays for the last one. That's our form. Behind them distinctly, an assessor murmured that the station rite concluded with the wreath-laying and the heir's evening departure was fixed by protocol, and that was when Joss Marek spoke for the first time since the landing, quietly to the heir, but the shrine yard was stone still and it carried. I'll be staying either way, he said. Whoever taught you to rule should start here. The heir looked at him one long second. Then she stepped to the bell and rang the first name and stayed for the last. Severin stayed too. It was the longest night of her professional life, and she spent it standing, because Olm stood, and a mistress of forms could be taught. The bell rang all night across the floodplain, name by name, rung in shifts by the village, and this would be in no circular, for 2 hours. Deep in the dark, by the heir of the tideward crown and the human she had named, side by side, taking turns at the striker, his hand in her hand, never once touching, keeping a rhythm so steady that the night itself seemed to organize around it. Toward dawn, Severin saw the heir falter on a name, saw her shoulders finally go. 3 years late, the brother, the recall, the gown that didn't fit and the future that did now, all of it coming down at once the way held water comes down, and saw the human do the single, most consequential thing of the entire vetting, which was nothing. He did not reach for her, he did not speak. He rang the next name himself, and the next, holding the rhythm like a man holding a gate, keeping the structure standing around her while she broke quietly inside it. And when she could ring again, he passed the striker back without a word, and the bell never missed. By the book, that was the moment Severin should have recorded a failure of consort solicitude. In the margin of the vetting book, by lamplight, in the smallest hand of her career, She wrote instead, "He carries grief the way he carries load. He does not perform comfort. He keeps the structure standing until the mourner can stand. Query, which is the courtesy?" The assessor's tallies for the grief station arrived predictably savage: solemnity, deficient, appearance, gross deficiency, adherence to right, irregular, departure protocol, violated. Appended was a formal complaint from the compact delegation that the AST had, quote, converted a sacred observance into a public works demonstration for personal advantage. Savarin ruled the station passed, second of 5, on the testimony of the headwoman of Marin Shallows, entered into the register verbatim under the form of the local witness, an instrument so old it predated the unification of the river nations, which held that in matters of grief the bereaved outranked the book. Olm's testimony was 4 sentences long. The last one was, "The compact sent a barge. The human cleared our channel. The surge came on the 3rd night, and the water went around us. You may tell the crown which grief was observed. The ruling went up the river like a flood pulse." Severin tracked its passage by the quality of what came back down. The court circulars stopped printing the heir's naming as the season's scandal and started printing it as the season's question. 2 of the 11 princes quietly withdrew their names from the slate, their houses citing the press of autumn business, which meant their stewards had read the water and decided the season was no longer a sure table. A pamphlet appeared in the low terraces, unsigned, woodcut printed, showing a man in a gill jacket knee-deep in a channel under the words "He showed up in the rain," and the palace censors confiscated 400 copies, which guaranteed 4,000. And Catherall Dom requested, through the chancellor, a private audience with the mistress of forms. He received her. The inversion was deliberate. She was summoned to be received. In the compact's river house above the city, in a room whose windows owned the whole southern floodplain, and he was charming for exactly as long as it took to pour the tea. "You ruled against my complaint at Marin Shallows," he said, "on the testimony of a bell ringer, on the testimony of the realm's grief, Lord Dom. The form is explicit. The form is medieval. You've dug 2 relics out of that book in 2 stations, Dame Severin, the drowning exception, the local witness, instruments no mistress of forms has touched in living memory. One might almost say you've stopped judging the asked and started advocating." He turned his cup precisely, a man who did everything precisely. "You are 61 years in office. Your successor will be appointed within the decade regardless. The compact maintains scholarly endowments for distinguished keepers of tradition. The work is light, the terrace is sunny, and the appointment could be arranged before the closing, before, let us say, the consequences of this season land on whoever has attached her name to it most generously." "That is a remarkable offer, my lord," Severin said. "I will record it in full." The precision stopped. "Record it? The vetting of an asked is a right of the register from naming to closing. Everything said to its officers concerning it is right material and is entered." She rose and bowed exactly as much as the room required and not 1 degree more. "It will sit in the register beside the trust accounts, my lord, which I have also been reading. 3 years of them. The register sees all instruments the crown seals, including land transfers in the southern floodplain, including the purchase of my lord's last 400 drowned acres, including the dates, which I have set against the dates of the trust's deferral motions, which my office is, by the oldest form of all, required to do with any pattern that touches a right in its keeping." She picked up her case. The floodplain lay in the windows behind him like a map on a gaming table. "Thank you for the tea. The register takes no endowments." She was in the corridor before she let her hands shake, and they shook all the way down the river stair, and what they shook with, she was surprised to find, was not fear. It was 61 years of cataloging other people's courage and the late ferocious discovery of her own. 3 stations remained. The fuse burned on toward equinox. The 3rd station was the table, and the court believed, with the serene confidence of people who had never eaten anywhere else, that the table would finish him. The form, a treaty banquet. The heir and her ask, seated before the assembled river nations, every course of negotiation, every gesture graded. The occasion that year was real and heavy. The renewal of the Saltmarsh Grain Accord, the agreement that fed the upland third of the realm, presided over by matriarch Ubrith of the Saltmarsh Combine, a woman of 80 who had begun her working life gutting fish on a cannery line and now controlled more tonnage than the Crown's own fleet. The compact wanted the Accord's carriage clauses. The Crown wanted the Combine's loyalty. The Combine, as far as anyone could determine, wanted to be amused. Severin drilled him for 6 days. Place settings, precedents, the 40 forms of the toast, which courses were eaten and which were only honored, the correct depth of attention owed a matriarch versus a chancellor versus a prince one had recently humiliated at a staircase. He absorbed it all with the grim diligence of a man memorizing a wiring diagram, and at the end of the 6th day he said the thing she had been waiting for him to say since the naming. This one frightens me. Good, Severin said. Why? Because the failure modes are social. He turned a fish fork over in his fingers like an unfamiliar fitting. A gate fails and I can see it fail, I can put hands on it. This room fails invisibly. You told me so, himself. The hall decides things and tells itself stories about why, and the stories get written down as if they were the things. He set the fork down in its correct position, which she noted, and looked at her across the practice table, and for the first time since the third sluice, he looked 26. Out there I know what I'm for, ma'am. In here I only know what I'm not. Severin regarded him, the mended cuff. She had quietly arranged a court tailor, and he had quietly declined, on the grounds that a man should be vetted in his own clothes. The engineer's hands, the steadiness that was not fearlessness after all, she saw now, but fear correctly loaded and carried. 61 years ago, she said, a junior registrar from a river clerk family sat her first state banquet, so, terrified she could not taste the food. An old keeper of forms leaned over to her between courses and said, "Child, stop trying to belong here. Nobody belongs here. The room belongs to whoever is most at peace with what they're for." She straightened the practice cloth, which did not need straightening. Eat what you recognize. Toast who you mean. And if the room turns on you, Master Merrick, do what you did at the staircase. Read the load path and put your hand where the structure is. The table was laid for 200 in the Hall of the Accord, and for 4 courses it went better than anyone had wagered. The human ate what he recognized. He toasted who he meant, the lock crews of the Southern Reach at their stations tonight, a toast that violated precedence by honoring the unpresent before the present, and was Severin observed returned by the entire Saltmarsh delegation, who knew exactly who kept their grain barges floating. Matriarch Ubrith, seated across the treaty cloth, watched him through the courses with eyes like wet shale, asked him one question about tide gauge calibration that was obviously a test, received an answer that was obviously sound, and grunted, a sound her whole delegation visibly knew how to read, like a tap on a barometer. Then, between the 5th course and the toasts of renewal, with the Accord signing folio already on its stand, the failure mode arrived, and it was social, and it was nothing the diagram had a line for. A server went down, not dramatically. That was the thing Severin would keep returning to in the months after, when she tried to establish exactly when she had stopped vetting Joss Merrick and started learning from him. The boy didn't crash into the table or drop a tureen on a prince. He simply folded, quietly at the service door the way the starving fold, knees first, tray clutched even as he went down because the body's last loyalty was to the rules of its employment. And the machinery of the banquet did what great houses train their machinery to do with a fallen server. It closed around the disturbance, 2 stewards lifting him smoothly backward through the door, a third sliding into his station, the whole event erased from the hall in under 10 seconds, and not one face at the high tables flickered because not one of them had registered it as having happened. One face at the high tables registered it. Severin saw him go still, the listening stillness, saw him track the service door, the smooth erasure, the replacement server's hands, which were also trembling, and she saw him do the arithmetic she would only complete later. The hollow cheeks under the powder, all down the service line, the trays carried slightly wrong, because carried by people working their second shift of the day for a steward who docked pay for the first. The palace had been economizing for 3 years. The economy had names, and they were carrying the fish course. He put down his glass and stood, and the hall noticed that. Matriarch, he said, across the treaty cloth, pitch no louder than the toasts had been. Before the renewal is signed, a question, if the table permits. The Accord moves your grain to the upland third. Who carries it the last mile? Not the barges, the hands. Ubrith's shale eyes glittered. Porters? Longshore crews, granary line. Why? Because the boy who just fainted behind that door is the granary line, Joss Merrick said. Same class of contract, same steward system, same docked wages. I know the system, Matriarch. I've shared a pay window with it for 4 years. The realm's about to renew the agreement that feeds a third of its people, and the people moving the food are going down at their stations in the building where it's being signed. He picked up the signing folio's cover page. Gross breach. The assessor's styluses leapt like startled fish, and read the carriage clause aloud, 11 words of it, and set it down. Cartage at rates customary. That word customary is doing a lot of quiet work tonight. I'd want to know what it cost before I honored it with my name. That's all. That's the question. The hall sat in a silence with weather in it. The chancellor was half reason. Catherall Dom was smiling the way men smile when an opponent finally does something fatal, because the Ast had just interrupted a treaty signing to side with the help, and there was no form anywhere in which that was anything but ruin. Matriarch Ubrith looked at the human for a long geological moment. Then she turned in her seat and said one sentence to her treaty clerk in the flat. Dialect of the cannery rose, and the clerk's pen began to move, and Ubrith turned back to the hall and raised her voice for the first time all evening. The combine amends its offer, she said. Carriage at posted rates, posted being posted on the wall where the crews can read them, audited by both houses each quarter. My mother carried fish guts up the cannery stairs until her heart stopped on the fourth landing, while the owners signed accords upstairs at rates customary. The shale eyes traversed the high tables and stopped, with unmistakable deliberation, on Catherall Dom. It is 60 years since anyone at one of these tables asked the question the human just asked. The combine signs the amended version tonight, or it ships nothing north before the freeze. The Crown may consult its forms. The Crown consulted its forms. The forms, as read aloud by the mistress of forms upon request, contained, to the visible astonishment of three-quarters of the hall and the visible astonishment of Joss Marrick, who had after all been drilled on every toast, an instrument called the form of the honest table, which held that no accord might be signed at a table where any person serving it stood in unremedied want, and which had been written, Severin announced with 61 years of dry satisfaction after the bread riots of the founding century, by a mistress of forms whose name she carried as her own middle name, the accord signed at posted rates. The steward of the service contracts was suspended before the sweet course, by a chancellor moving with the speed of a man amputating his own infected finger, and the fallen server boy, revived in the kitchens, was sent for by the matriarch herself, who sat him at the combine's table for the toasts of renewal, ate beside him, and asked him his grandmother's name, because in the cannery rows that was how you told someone they had been seen. The assessor's tally for the table ran 9 violations, including standing without leave, addressing across the treaty cloth, handling instruments of state, and interrupting a signing. The compact's formal complaint ran to 4 pages. Severin's ruling ran to 1 sentence. The station asked whether the ass could sit at the realm's table. He is the only person who noticed the realm was serving it. Passed, 3rd of 5. That night, the Queen summoned her again to the chart room, and was standing again at the southern floodplain, and did not turn around again, and said, 3 rulings, 3 relics dug out of the book in his favor. The houses are saying my mistress of forms has fallen in love. The houses are 40 years too late with that charge, Majesty, Severin said evenly. I fell in love in this building once. It was with the book. She set her case down. I am not bending it for him. That is the report I came to make, and I will make it once plainly, Registrar to Crown, and you may have my seal after it if you find it wanting. I have kept the forms of this realm for 61 years on the belief that they were the dike, the thing that holds back what people would otherwise do to each other. 3 stations into this vetting, I find half the book silted like the Marin Channel. Forms kept for the keeping, protecting nothing, carrying nothing, maintained because maintenance is cheaper than thought. And then this human walks through the season reading every room like a load diagram, and wherever he puts his hand, something 3 centuries old that actually works comes up out of the silt shining, the drowning exception, the local witness, the honest table. Majesty, he is not failing the book. He is proof testing it, and it is passing in exactly the places we stopped reading. The Queen was silent so long the lamps ticked. My son, she said finally, would have liked him. It was the first time in 3 years Severin had heard her say my son. My daughter does considerably more than like him, which a mother sees, whatever a court pretends. So I will tell you the thing I cannot say on the throne, Severin, and you will hold it with the rest. She turned. The winter face had cracked open all the way for once, and what was behind it was not soft. It was harder than the winter, and very tired, and entirely awake. I read the trust accounts the night after the staircase. I have spent 3 years grieving in procedure because procedure was the only room where the grief fit, and a man with paper on half my floodplain found that convenient, and I let it be convenient, and 1,900 of my subjects' names get rung on a bell every autumn, partly because the Crown signed deferral motions at rates customary. Her hands, folded, were white at the knuckle. 2 stations remain. The walk of banks is his ground. Even Dom knows it. Dom will therefore do something about the ground. Watch the ground, Severin, and when the closing comes, whatever the day brings, and I now believe the day will bring something, the register rules, and the Crown stands on the ruling, whatever it is. You have my word at last, with no instruction folded inside it. Severin bowed lower than the form required, for the first time in her life. Walking back through the night palace, she passed the long gallery above the water gardens and found 2 figures at the chaperone's distance on the moonlit terrace below, the heir and the asked, with the heir's sworn shield posted correctly in sight, the 3 of them inside the forms with a fastidiousness that had itself become a quiet statement to the court. We will be unimpeachable. We will give you nothing. The 2 of them stood at the balustrade a wrench's length apart, not touching, looking down the dark line of the river, and their voices carried up the stone in fragments, his low, posted where the crews can read them. 60 years, Aunt. It took one question, and hers after a moment, with a fierce quiet that made Severin stop walking. You keep doing the thing nobody taught me. You keep showing me that it's allowed. It's your realm, you're allowed. That's not. The air turned to face him, and the moonlight took her, and Severin, 61 years a cataloger of faces, catalogued this one. Not the girl from the dais, not the student from the office doorway. Something arriving that was going to wear a crown the way he wore a wrench. When they recalled me, I made a list of everything I'd never be. Graceful, beloved, ready, my brother's equal. I kept it where the maids wouldn't find it. The night before the naming, I went down to the gallery of wheels to add never brave enough to choose, and I stood there listening to the water, and I realized the list was a maintenance log, Joss. Every line on it was just something nobody had ever maintained. And there was exactly one person in my whole life who'd ever picked up a tool when something of mine needed maintaining instead of writing me up for being broken. Her chin went up, the deckhand said of it. So I skipped 11 princes. The court can spend the rest of the season asking why. You're the only one who's never asked me why. I know why, he said, same reason I stood. A pause, the river ran. The sworn shield studied the architecture with a guardian's tact. First morning, 400 steps down, the heir of the whole wet world walks into my gallery at dawn looking like a kit dropped on the wrong site. And I thought, there's the only other person in this palace who knows the feeling. We got assigned lives off the slate, both of us. Everything since is just proving the name. A small wind moved on the terrace. 2 more stations, she said. 2 more stations, he said, ma'am. And the title, deployed there after everything, at that hour, in that voice, was somehow the single most intimate thing Severin had heard spoken in the palace in 61 years, and the heir laughed her short, real laugh, and Severin made herself walk on and did not write any of it in any book. Some things the register did not need. Some things the register, she was beginning to understand, had been built to make room around. The petition arrived 3 days later with the seals of the 5 remaining suitor houses upon it. 4 had now withdrawn, demanding, on grounds of accumulating irregularity, that the question of the ask be removed from the register's sole keeping and placed before a tribunal of the houses at the next convocation. It was Dom's hand inside every clause. Outvoted at the stations, he was changing the venue. The chancellor, to his thin credit, ruled the petition out of form. The season was the register's from naming to closing. 300 years unbroken, but he ruled it with the face of a man watching weather come in, and he was right too, because the petition had never been meant to succeed. It had been meant to put a sentence into the realm's circulation. And the sentence was, if the book will not give the houses justice, the houses will remember other instruments. Severin filed it, annotated it, and added 1 line to her private log that she would later enter into the official record under oath. From this date, I ceased to regard Lord Dom as a suitor pursuing a marriage, and began to regard him as an engineer pursuing a failure. We were both, by then, reading Load Paths. The difference was what we wanted the structure to do. The 4th station was the Walk of Banks, and the storm came with it, and afterward the river people would say the 2 had arrived together on purpose, the way omens do. Severin, who did not believe in omens, would only ever record what the gauges recorded. The first winter surge of the year, 11 days early, riding a 3/4 tide. The Walk was the oldest station of the 5, older than the palace, the river folk claimed. Once a year, before the winter closed in, the crown walked its banks. The heir, her party, the marshal of the banks, and the assembled dignity of the realm, processing the great southern dike from the Leor sluices to the Edron Memorial, while the river country turned out to see with its own eyes that the crown still knew what it stood on. For an asked, the form was simple presence, walk beside her, in front of the realm, on the realm's true foundation. For this ask, Severin had assumed, the station would be the gift of the calendar, his ground, as the queen had said, which was why she had spent 11 days asking herself what she would do to that ground if she were Catherine Dom, and why she had requisitioned, quietly, under a register seal nobody thought to question, the duty rosters of the bank wardens for the procession, route, and found that the compact's friends in the trust had reassigned the 3 most senior wardens of the Edron reach to a survey upriver, and replaced them with men whose names appeared on compact payrolls, and that the procession's order of march, drafted in the chancellery but amended in committee, now routed the entire court, the queen, the heir, the delegations, 400 people in ceremonial dress, across the crest of the Edron dike itself, at the hour of the equinoctial high water, for the laying of a wreath at the memorial of the 1900. It was beautiful, as engineering went. She could admire it the way one admires a predator's skeleton in a museum. If the dike held, the compact had honored the dead magnificently. If the dike, starved of 3 years of maintenance by the compact's own motions, failed under the assembled court, then the human whose contract covered its inspection was ruined. The heir who had named him was ruined. The crown that had indulged them was shaken to its mortar, and the floodplain land values would trough for a decade of cheap buying. Heads, a funeral wreath. Tails, a funeral. She took it to the marshal of the banks. Marshal Curran was a fortress of a woman, 60 years on the dikes, mud-gray skin weathered to the texture of facing stone. And she had no patience for the court and less for the register. But she had been at Marin Shallows for the ringing. Every marshal stood the ringing. And when Severin laid the rosters and the amended march order side by side on her plotting table, Curran looked at them for the length of one tide gauge tick and said a word that the register's transcription standards rendered as an expression of concern. "I can't strike the route," the marshal said. "March orders sealed by the chancellery. I'd need cause, and the cause is a feeling and a registrar's filing. And if I walk the crest myself the day before with every probe I own, I find what the toe of a dike always shows after 3 dry budgets. Seepage you can argue about. He's lawyered the ground, mistress. Whatever I find, his people on the rosters certify it sound, and the court walks." "Then we are agreed the court walks into an argument," Severin said. "I have brought you the other party to it." And she opened the door for Joss Merrick, who had spent the 11 days she'd spent on rosters, walking the Adrian reach at dawn with the air and a probe rod, gate by gate, stain by stain, filling a notebook whose contents he now laid on the plotting table beside the marshal's charts. The tow-line seepage mapped and dated, the relief culverts silted shut on a schedule that matched the deferral motions to the season, and one page, flagged in grease pencil, that made Curran go still the way he went still. "The old Leor relief locks," he said. "The garden locks. They're on the register's own plan of the palace reach. Marshal. The founders cut them to bleed a surge out of the southern dike into the low ground, before the crest ever takes the full head. 6 gates, sound iron. I've kept them turning 4 years because I keep everything turning. The low ground they bleed into is the Crown Gardens," Curran finished, slow, "the founders' overflow basin, which the dynasty has spent 300 years planting." She looked up from the page, from the man to the mistress of forms and back. "You're proposing to me the day before the walk that if the Edrin crest takes a surge with the court on it, the remedy on the books since the founding is to drown the most celebrated garden in the river nations under 6 feet of working river." "No, Marshal," Joss Merrick said. "I'm reporting to you that the remedy exists, that it's mine to operate under my contract, that it takes 19 minutes to run all 6 gates with a trained crew, and that I've had a trained crew drilling it for a week." He let that sit. "Whether anyone gives the order, that's above my pay window. But the walk is going over that crest at high water with both of them on it, and I wanted the order already drilled before anybody needed it. That's all preparation is, ma'am, deciding in dry weather." Curran studied him, the notebook, the grease pencil, the 4 years of turning everything. Then she rolled up the flag page and put it inside her coat against the weather. 3, she said to him, and Severin realized the marshal had been at the audience too, and at the table, and was answering a count nobody had spoken aloud. "Walk the walk, human. If the day comes to it, the order will have a marshal's voice on it." The day came to it. The storm made landfall at the coast in the night and ran up the river valley against the equinoctial tide, and the morning of the walk dawned green-black to the south with the gauges climbing a hand's width an hour, and the chancellery, 400 dignitaries dressed, the river country lining the banks in oilskins, the compact circulars already speaking of the magnificence of compact grief at the memorial, looked at the climbing gauges and the sealed march order and did what institutions do. It proceeded. Severin walked the crest of the Edrin dike 11 places behind the air, rain driving in off the water, the river running high and hard and the color of slag on the right hand, the low country with its 1,000 lamps on the left, and she felt it through her boot soles before she heard anyone name it. A wrongness in the ground itself, a fat, dull tremor under the procession's feet, the dike carrying the surge the way a tired man carries a third sack. Joss Merrick felt it too. She watched him feel it. He had walked the whole station with textbook correctness beside the air, 2 fists of air between them. Bareheaded in the rain and mid-stride, a quarter-mile short of the memorial, he stopped and put his palm flat on the crest path the way he had put it under the dead shred, and Severin saw his lips move, counting, timing the shutter against the wave sets, and then he stood up and said, to the air first, because the forms were the forms and she was the crown present, "It's moving. The toe's gone soft under the old breech section. It's piping, Highness. This crest has maybe the turn of the tide left in it, and the tide doesn't turn for 2 hours." And then the second thing, immediately, loud, pitched down the procession to where the marshal walked. Marshal Curran, Boils at the toe, breach section, 200 paces back. Your wardens are standing in them. What happened in the next 19 minutes entered the register from the sworn statements of 40 witnesses, and Severin, who took half the statements herself, never found two that disagreed. The compact payroll warden captain declared the dike sound in the procession's continuation a matter of sealed chancellery order. Prince Catherall Dom, morning blue against the stormlight, observed in a carrying voice that the ask seemed determined to convert even the realms dead into a stage, and that perhaps the gauges, like the staircases and the banquet tables, obligingly performed for him, and a stretch of the court, soaked, frightened, and grateful for any voice promising the day was normal, laughed and made to walk on. Jos Merrick turned his back on the prince, on the whole procession, faced the warden crews in the boils below, and countermanded the captain on the open dike in the plain bellow of a works foreman over weather. Off the toe? All crews off? Upslope? Now, you can't pipe watch a boil you're standing in. Get off it. And the crews, who were rivermen under compact friendly officers, looked at their captain and looked at the man in the gill jacket who had cleared the Marin Channel in the rain and obeyed the jacket. The marshal of the banks reached into her coat in the driving rain and took out a rolled page flagged in grease pencil and put her voice on the order. And the heir of the tideward crown. This was the part the river country would keep, the part the woodcuts would carry into every low terrace kitchen before the week was out. The heir pulled off her ceremonial glove, took the speaking horn from the marshal's own hand, and gave the founder's order herself, in the field voice he had taught her over 100 dawns, with the rain flat in her face and her dead brother's deek groaning under her boots. Lear relief crews, open the garden locks, all 6. Run them full. Drown my gardens and save my country. In the crown's name, open. 19 minutes. Severin stood on the shuddering crest among 400 of the realm's great and watched downriver. The 6 iron mouths of the founder's mercy grind open one after another exactly as drilled. Watched the slag-colored river pour itself roaring into the crown gardens, over the parterres, over the heir's grandmother's arboretum, over 300 years of dynastic horticulture, and watched the gauges on the Edron reach, fat with murder all morning, hesitate and sigh, and begin, hands width by hands width, to come down. The dike held. The low country's 1,000 lamps stayed lit. The court processed off the crest in a silence that had nothing of ceremony in it, and at the memorial of the 1900 the wreath was laid in a wind that smelled of drowned roses. And nobody anywhere on the river argued about the watermarks afterward, because the river people had watched the whole thing from the banks, in oilskins in their tens of thousands. The Crown Gardens were a brown lake by nightfall. The damage filings called it the costliest single act of deliberate destruction of Crown property in the dynasty's history. The instrument of charge arrived at the register the next morning, under the seals of the compact and the warden captaincy, against Jos Merrick, asked of the season for usurpation of command, incitement of crews against lawful officers, and destruction of the property of the Crown. Capital articles, the petition noted, in 3 reigns out of the last 7. The compact had finally found its tribunal. Destruction of Crown property lay outside the season's forms, in the ordinary courts, where the book that protected him didn't run. Except that it didn't lie there, and Severin had 61 years of knowing exactly where everything lay. She convened the hearing herself in the Hall of Audience, under the register's seal, on the 2nd day after the storm, convened it as a station inquiry, because the alleged acts had occurred during a station of the season, in the conduct of the asked, and the season is the register's from naming to closing, 300 years unbroken, and she stood at her lectern with the charge sheet before her and the queen on the tide throne above her, and she said, the register will hear witnesses, and the doors opened, and the vetting of Jos Merrick became for one morning the realm looking at itself. Lance Warden Kyrell testified to a staircase and to what the painted over rot had meant about who looked and who didn't. Headwoman Olm of Marin Shallows testified to a channel, a bell, and a surge that went around her village on the 3rd night. She had come up river through the storm's wake to do it, and she gave her 4 sentences again and added a 5th. You ask, was it destruction? What he did to the gardens. We ring 1,900 names every autumn for what economy did to my street. Nobody ever rings for a rosebush. Matriarch Ubrith sent her treaty clerk with 1 notarized sentence. The combine contracts at posted rates only with realms that intend to exist next year and regards the events at the Edron Dike as material assurance. Marshal Curran of the banks testified for 1 hour with charts and ended on the grease-flagged page. The founders' relief locks, their purpose written plainly on the register's own plan of the palace reach, the order drilled in dry weather by the man now charged for running it. Usurpation, she said, and let the word stand alone a moment in the hall. I have walked dikes for 60 years. Command of a failing structure belongs to whoever can see the failure. That's not insubordination, that's physics. The human held command of that crest for 19 minutes and then handed it back, which is more than I can say for the officers who certified boils as puddles. If the register wants my professional finding, the crest had the turn of the tide left in it. There were 400 people on it. Among them stood every heir of every house on the river. He didn't destroy crown property. The marshal looked up at the tide-thrown fortress flat. He spent it on the only morning in 300 years it was ever needed for what it was built for. And then the heir rose from her place below the throne, against all advice, and was sworn like any witness, and testified that the order to open the locks had been given by the crown's own voice in the crown's own name, taking the act and its glory and its ruin onto herself before the assembled realm, and looked, while she said it, not at the tribunal benches, but at the man in the answering square, with a face that the assessor's styluses could do nothing whatever about. Severin ruled within the hour. The charges, falling within a station, fell to the register. The register found the acts proven and the acts lawful, under the oldest instrument she had yet pulled out of the silt, the form of the standing order, founding century, which bound every keeper of the works to act against the water first and the hierarchy second, and which contained the sentence, 300 years old and shining, that she read aloud to the hall twice. In the hour of the water, the realm is whoever holds the gate. The station is ruled past, 4th of 5, she said. The charge of destruction is dismissed, with the registers finding that the crown gardens, planted in the founder's overflow basin, stood for 3 centuries as a debt the dynasty owed the river, and that the debt was honorably paid at need. Costs of replanting are assessed against the Lock Trust's deferred maintenance account, where the register finds the true authors of the morning. Her eyes came up off the page and found Catherine Dom in the hall, and 61 years of court training kept everything out of her face except the ruling. The season proceeds to the closing of the year. 1 station remains. That evening, the last 3 suitor houses but one withdrew from the slate. The circulars, counting on their fingers, observed that of the 11 princes of the naming, only the inland compact remained, and that the compact's prince had begun in select company to speak warmly of the grand old ceremony of the closing, and of his keen anticipation of seeing the ask demonstrate his celebrated competence upon the mother gate herself before the assembled realm at the equinox tide. Severin read that sentence 4 times, cold to the bone, and sent for the marshal, and for the human, and for the duty rosters of the great lock. The mother gate was the realm. That was not poetry. It was the founding arrangement. The great lock sat across the throat of the river above Leor Terrace, 2 leaves of iron-bound stone 40 feet high, and twice a year, at the opening of the waters in spring, at the closing of the year at the autumn equinox, the leaves were swung and the realm's whole calendar swung with them. The dynasty's first charter had been signed on the mother's sill. The tide stage below the gate, a great stepped apron of stone, held the entire court at the closing, the way it had held it for 300 years. The crown above on the gatehouse balcony, the realm below on the apron, and between them the mother, closing on the equinox tide, the realm's oldest promise that the water could be told where to stop. The 5th station of any season was simply to stand the closing beside the heir. No ass in history had been required to do more than stand it. The compact's motion, introduced in the Lock Trust, seconded by its pensioned friends, worded as an honor, proposed that this year, in recognition of the ass's celebrated contributions to the realm's waters, the ceremonial turning of the mother's master wheel be performed by his own distinguished hands. The court, still drying out from the Edrin storm and badly needing something to applaud, applauded. The chancellor, boxed by the applause, sealed it. The trap closed with the whole realm smiling at it, and Severin sat at her lectern reading the sealed order of ceremony and understood that she was looking at the naming's answer arrived at last. Dom had stopped trying to fail the man at the court's game, and had moved the final station onto the man's own ground, because on the man's own ground a failure would not merely embarrass him, it would hang him. The mother gate, starved 2 budgets past her proof tests, turned before the assembled realm by the human contractor responsible for her, and if she stuck, if she sheared, if the equinox tide came through a gate that would not close, onto the tide stage where 400 of the realm stood in ceremonial dress, he doesn't need her to fail catastrophically, Joss Merrick said quietly, in the marshal's plotting room, the night they read the sealed order together. That's the elegant part. She just needs to stick with my hands on the wheel. 40 feet of stuck gate, the tide coming up the apron, the court wading to the stairs in their robes while I haul on a dead wheel. Nobody drowns, everybody remembers. The name fails the 5th station in front of the whole realm. The register can't rule around a gate the realm watch not close. And every ruling before it gets reread as the register indulging a fraud. He doesn't have to beat the book anymore, ma'am. He just has to make the book look like mine. Then she must not stick, Marshal Curran said. She won't, he said. I've got 11 days. I'll strip the tumbler race myself, proof what I can without the trust's funds, and I'll walk her through the closing turn every slack tide between now and the equinox. She's old and she's been starved, but she's founder's work. There's no rot in her, just neglect. 11 days of honest hands and she'll turn like a bride. He caught himself on the word. The plotting room's lamp ticked. The marshal developed an interest in her charts, and Savorin wrote nothing down and filed the moment where she was filing things now. For 10 of the 11 days that held. On the 10th night, the heir came to Severin's office again, unannounced, alone, at the hour of the trimmed lamps, the mirror of the season's first visit, and they both felt it, and neither said so. She put a sealed paper on the lectern. A statement, she said, under register seal, to be opened only if the closing fails. It says the order to attempt the turn was mine over his objection given as crown. It says the fault is mine alone. Her chin was up. Her hands were flat at her sides. She had rehearsed this. He carried 4 stations of this realm's contempt for me. He is not carrying the 5th into a noose. Enter it. Severin read it through twice, taking her time, and then did something she had done only once before in 61 years of keeping instruments. She set a submitted document in the lamp flame and held it there until it was ash. The register declines the entry, Highness, on the grounds that it is false, she said over the heir's blazing silence. And the register does not enter falsehoods, however nobly built. He has made no objection. You will give no such order. What you have written is not a confession. It is a goodbye, drafted by a girl who still half believes the court was right about her, that anything she chooses must secretly be a catastrophe someone else will pay for. She came around the lectern, and for the first time in 3 years of vetting and 61 of office, she took a royal hand in both of hers, papery grip over field calluses. Hear the finding of your own registrar, who has measured everything in this building twice. You chose better than the book, child. The stations did not prove him in spite of your judgment. They proved your judgment. Whatever the equinox brings, you will stand on the gatehouse balcony as the crown that named him, not the woman apologizing for it, or 61 years of my ink are wasted, and I do not waste ink. The heir stood a long moment, jaw working, sea-glass eyes wet and level, and then she laughed, the short, real laugh, wrecked at the edges. He said you'd burn it. Did he? He said. She's the best instrument in the palace, and good instruments refuse bad readings. She stopped at the door, the old habit, and looked back. When this is over, Dame Severin, however it ends, the first thing I do as queen, whenever that is going to be done on your advice. I wanted one person in this building to know that in advance. Severin sat alone afterward for some time, with the ash of the falsehood in the lamp tray, and entered, in her private log, against every regulation governing private logs. Tonight I was offered the only bribe of my keepership I was tempted to take, the heir's whole trust, and I find I have accepted it, and would burn the book itself before I let it prove a bad reading. Note for my successor. This office is not what they will tell you it is. We do not keep the forms. We keep the people the forms were cut for. Severin spent them on her own ground. If the gate was his structure, the right was hers, and she went into the register's deep shelves the way he went into a tumbler race, and she proofed every form that touched the closing, the order of ceremony, the precedence of the gatehouse balcony, the instruments of interruption and recess and abort, and she found what she was looking for in a founding century appendix, sewn into the binding in, thread older than the dynasty's 3rd house, the form of witnessed work, the rite by which the founders had consecrated the mother herself. No work of the water, once begun before the realm as witness, may be called off save by the hand that works it. The realm that asks the water to be held has no right to flinch from the holding. The founders had written it to stop exactly what Severin intended it to stop. Lords on dry balconies overruling the one pair of hands actually on the wheel. She memorized its citation until she could speak it asleep, and told no one but the queen, who read it twice, and looked at her mistress of forms for a long moment, and said, "You are arming yourself to overrule my own chancellery at my own closing." And Savarin said, "Yes, Majesty." And the queen handed it back and said, "Good." On the 11th day, the equinox, the realm came to the river. They came in the tens of thousands, the low terraces emptying onto the banks, the river nation's barges moored rail to rail, the tide stage filling from dawn with the court enclosing white, and the gauges running exactly as the almanac promised. A strong equinoctial flood, the year's great tide due to peak at the 3rd hour after noon, when the mother would swing shut before it and the year would be closed. Severin stood the morning on the gatehouse balcony at the register station, the vetting book open to its last unsigned page, and watched Joss Merrick and his crew make their final slackwater inspection far below, small gray figures on the mother's sill, and watched him come up the gatehouse stair at noon with salt rime on his jacket, and report to the marshal, in her hearing, the sentence every keeper longs to say with the realm watching. She's ready, smooth as new work. I turned her through a quarter arc at slack, and she sang. At the second hour, the air took her place. At the half, the horns. The court settled on the apron below like white birds. Catherall Dom stood in the first rank of the tide stage in morning blue, still technically the last suitor of the slate, entitled to the first rank, with his house around him, and Severin, looking down from the balcony, registered with a registrar's eye for wrongness that the compact party alone, of all the apron, stood at the back of the first rank rather than its front, nearest the stairs, nearest the high ground. She had time to think. He knows the gate will stick. He is standing where you stand when you know. And then to think, colder. He does not hope she sticks. He has made sure of it. Between the quarter arc at slack and now he has made sure, and then the third hour struck and the realm went silent, and the air's voice rang the founder's sentence off the water, close the year. And Joss Merrick set his hands on the master wheel before the eyes of the assembled realm and turned it, and the mother gate moved 11 degrees and stopped. The sound she made was wrong before anything was visibly wrong. Severin heard the human hear it, saw his head come up like the staircase, like the crest. Not the deep iron singing of the practice turns, but a flat, dead clank from inside the western leaf, the sound of something in a machine's throat that the machine had not swallowed. He took the wheel through a half-span back and forward, feeling, reading, and the gate sat fat and immovable at 11 degrees with the year's great tide coming up the river like a wall of slow gray muscle, and 40 feet below the balcony, 400 of the realm stood on a stone apron designed to be dry behind a closed gate, and the first long swells of the flood were already licking the apron's lowest step. The balcony erupted. Chancellery officers, horns, the warden captain shouting for the ceremonial abort, clear the stage, declare the closing failed, and Catherall Dom's voice rose from the apron's first rank, pitched beautifully to carry to every barge and bank, rich with sorrow. Get the court to the stairs. The realm has trusted its mother to a man who could not keep her. Must it drown for him too? And Severin Olu Maraith stepped to the rail of the gatehouse balcony with the register open on her arm and did the thing her whole life had been a preparation for without her knowledge. The register speaks. 61 years of trained projection, pitched not at the balcony but at the realm. The horns faltered. The realm had been raised on the forms. The forms spoke. The realm went quiet to hear. The closing of the year is consecrated under the form of witnessed work, founding century, appendix to the right of the mother's making, citation entered and sealed. She read it, full voice, off her own arm. No work of the water once begun before the realm as witness may be called off save by the hand that works it. The hand that works it is on the wheel. No officer, no captain, no chancellor, one beat. She had waited 61 years to choose a pause this carefully, and no suitor commands this closing while his hands hold iron. The realm asked the water to be held. The realm stands witness to the holding. The register rules. The work continues, and from the wheel, flat, loud foreman over weather, already stripping off his ceremonial sash and his jacket with it. Marshal, she's jammed in the tumbler race, West Leaf. Something's been fed into her since slack. I'm going down into the chase. I need the inspection way unlocked, and I need light, and I need somebody on the counterweight wheel who knows her hands from her feet, because when I clear it, the leaf will want to run, and somebody has to take her weight smooth, or she'll shear the chain. The counterweight wheel takes two, Marshal Cowarn said, already moving. It takes two. I know her turn. The heir of the tideward crown was already pulling off her closing white's outer robe, already in the field boots she had worn under the gown of the realm's most ceremonial day. She had dressed for weather under the silk. She had been his crew for 100 dawns, and she had dressed for weather. And the gatehouse heard her say it in the field voice, level as a sill. I've turned her at slack 11 times, Joss. I know her turn. For 1/2 second, before the realm, the man and the heir looked at each other, and the whole season was in it, and nobody anywhere, not the assessors, not the circulars, not 61 years of the register, had a column for what passed. Then take her weight, he said highness, and went over the rail of the inspection, weighing down into the mother's throat with the tide coming. What the realm saw for the next 21 minutes was almost nothing, and the almost nothing became the most retold ceremony in the dynasty's history. A man vanishing into a 40-foot gate with the year's great tide rising against the far side of it. The heir of the realm at the counterweight wheel with the marshal of the banks, white silk-soaked gray, holding the tension he called up to them through the chase. Half a turn, hold, quarterback, hold her, her voice and his voice, keeping each other steady through 40 feet of stone, while the water climbed the apron step by step, and the court stood its ground because the heir was standing hers, and the register stood at the rail above with the book open, ruling down every officer who moved to interfere, 11 times by citation. in a voice that never once shook. In the 14th minute, the tide found the chase. Everyone on the gatehouse heard it happen. The voice coming up the inspection way went from hoarse to half-drowned between one call and the next. The words arriving wrapped in the slap and boom of water working into stone, and the rhythm of his counts slowed to the pace of a man timing his breathing to the swells. Working blind in the mother's throat with the year's great tide swallowing his light, the marshal's face did its arithmetic and went gray. And Cathral Dawn made his last move of the season. He came up the gatehouse stairs with 2 chancellery officers and the full authority of the first rank, voice pitched in statesman's anguish, and demanded the heir be removed from the counterweight wheel, for her safety, for the succession, for the realm. The dynasty could not be permitted to wager its last heir on a workman's wager. Let the wardens take her weight, or better, let the work be abandoned, and the man recalled while he could still climb. "Touch your hands off that iron," Marshal Curran said, without turning her head, "and the leaf runs, the chain shears, and the man in the chase comes out of it in pieces. Stand away from my wheel." "Wardens," Dom said, "your duty is to the crown's body," and Lance Warden Kyrell, posted at the wheel platform's stair, who had once put his arm across a rotten staircase in front of his queen, put his pike across the stair in front of his prince, and said, loudly enough for the register to certify every word, "My lord, the last time this man said a structure would fail, I had to choose between an order and the truth in about 1 second. I've had a season to practice since. The heir holds her wheel." It was the queen who ended it. The queen, who had stood statue still at the balcony rail through all 14 minutes, and who now turned her winter face on the last prince of the slate and spent on him, in public, the only sentence of raw grief she had permitted herself in 3 years. "I have already buried the child who trusted your accounting, my lord. I am learning to keep the one who trusts her own hands." Severin sight him down. "Form of witnessed work, 3rd clause," Severin said, "with the whole realm's silence carrying it to the banks. He who troubles the hand that works the water shall be reckoned the flood's own advocate, and stand from this hour with the water, against the realm." The oldest anathema in the book. 40,000 people heard it land on the inland compact like the gate of a lock. Dom went down the stairs with his officers, white to the hairline, into a first rank that had quietly, while he argued, stopped leaving him room, and the heir, who had not turned her head once through any of it, called her next count down the chase, steady, in the field voice. "Quarterback, hold her, I've got you." What Severin saw, because she never left the rail, was the realm learning what it was watching. She saw it move through the tens of thousands on the banks like a tide of its own. The understanding that the heir's hands were on working iron in front of them, that the human in the gate's throat was theirs, had been theirs since a channel at Marin Shallows, since a staircase, since posted rates, that what was being closed down there was not a gate. She heard the sound begin somewhere on the eastern bank, low, rhythmic, and spread barge to barge and bank to bank until it was the realm entire, keeping time for the 2 voices nobody could hear, the dike workers' hauling chant, the one the river crews had sung at the Founders' Works for 300 years, 30,000 voices, steady as a bell, all the way down both banks. In the 21st minute, the mother's west leaf shuddered, and a sound came up out of the chase that the river people still imitate for their grandchildren. The dead clank again, and then a man's voice, hoarse and tinny up the inspection way, shouting one word, "Clear!" And the heir and the marshal took the counterweight smooth as new work, and the mother gate of Leor Terrace swung through her remaining 79 degrees and closed on the equinox tide, with the deep iron singing the founders had promised. And the year's great flood arrived 4 minutes later and broke against her, white and enormous and beaten, and did not pass. The realm came apart in a roar they heard. The barge masters swore at the coast. Joss Merrick came up out of the inspection way into it, soaked black, bleeding from both forearms, carrying his pry bar in one hand, and in the other, held high deliberately before 40,000 witnesses and every assessor and circular writer in the river nations, because 4 stations had taught him exactly how this court wrote its stories. The thing he had cleared from the mother's tumbler race, a wedge of bright new-cut bronze, machined, deliberate, fed into the race through the proof port since slack water, its stock unmistakable to every soldier on the apron, because ceremonial honor pikes are unmistakable, and the Inland Compact's honor guard had carried theirs at every station of the season. He did not accuse anyone. He had no need. He crossed the gatehouse, dripping, to where Severin stood at the rail with the register, and he laid the bronze wedge on the open book like a man making a deposition, and he said in the silence of 40,000 people listening, the only words of the entire closing the circulars would print in capitals. "Entered into the record, ma'am. The mother didn't stick. She was gagged." Marshal Curran's wardens took the Compact's honor guard's pikes at the apron's stairs. The marshal had thought of the stairs before Dahman could reach them, and found the seventh pike's head new cut and a hand's length short, its bronze a grain match the armorers would confirm by lamplight that same night, and took, with the pikes, the compact's master of chains, whose name stood on the mother's proof-port roster at slack water, and who, facing the apron and the realm and the air in her soaked silk, did not hold his silence so much as fling it from him, naming his lord with the particular fury of a man who had been promised the gate would only stick. Catherall Dom stood very still in the first rank, at the back of it, nearest the stairs, with the realm turning toward him rank by rank like a tide changing, and Severin watched him understand his position the way an engineer understands a load path, completely and far too late. The unmaking of the inland compact took the winter, and it was done. This was the Queen's design, and Severin executed it with a registrar's relish, entirely by the book. No mobs, no attainder, no theater. The master of chains' deposition was taken under seal that night and entered. The armorer's grain match was entered. The proof-port roster was entered. The register's 3-year collation of trust deferrals against floodplain purchases was entered. Page upon page, each one read aloud in open session in Severin's flattest procedural voice, which the circulars described as the most frightening sound heard in the Hall of Audience in living memory. Catherall Dom was stripped of his place on the slate by the same instrument that had put him there, tried before the river courts for the gagging of the mother, an offense so old that the penalty clause was written in the first dialect and had to be glossed by scholars, and convicted on the testimony of, among 40 others, his own engineers who had been promised the gate would only stick, and who had stood on that apron with their families when the tide came up it. The drowned acres he had bought for the price of mud were assessed for the restoration of the lock trust at the price of land behind a working dike, which beggared his house in a single line of arithmetic. The river people who had wanted him hanged watched the book do something slower and found, somewhat to their own surprise, that they preferred it. He was sentenced at rates customary, said the woodcut that went through the low terraces that winter, over a carving of the register open on its lectern, and Severin, shown a copy, laughed for the first time in years and pinned it inside her office door. The 5th station she ruled on the evening of the closing itself, before the realm had even gone home, from the gatehouse balcony, with the mother singing closed behind her and the apron still thronged. The 5th station of the season asked whether the asked could stand the closing of the year beside the air, she read. The register finds that he closed it, past 5th of 5. The season is complete. The name spoken at the naming is proved true. She let the roar spend itself off the water. Then she turned to the last unsigned page of the vetting book and unstoppered the betrothal ink, the old ink, salt set, that the register had mixed to the same recipe for 300 years, the ink that did not fade and could not be scraped. And in her own hand, before the realm, she wrote the entry she had refused, 1 season and a lifetime of certainty ago, to believe the book could ever carry Jos Marek, of Earth, son of Tomas Marek, dock machinist, and Ina Marek, crane operator, journeyman engineer of the Terran Waterworks Guild, keeper of the works of the Palace Reach, named by Anthea Selene, here of the Tideward Crown, at the naming of the season in her own voice, unforced, vetted by my hand at 5 stations, proved at a staircase, a channel, a table, a crest, and the mother's own throat line. 2 generations of competence, which the register, having now measured both, rules equal to 300 years of blood, and in flood, superior. She signed it. The Queen, beside her at the rail, took the pen. This was in no order of ceremony. And the assessors simply stood and watched it happen. And beneath the mistress of form's signature, in the winter hand that had signed 3 years of grief into procedure, Marivel Ursuline wrote 1 word, witnessed. The betrothal itself they held in spring, and they held it, over the formal objection of the Chancellery and the delighted connivance of the entire river country, not in the hall of the naming but on the mother's sill at slack water, because the heir said her vows belonged where the realms were kept. The court came down the 400 steps in its finery and stood on working, stone among the lock crews and the pump girls. Headwoman Ohm came up river with half of Mare and Shallows and stood as kin of the groom's side. On the grounds, she said flatly, that whoever shows up in the rain is family, and the register consulted found a form for it. Matriarch Ubrith sent grain barges dressed in flags and a wedding gift of a single fish-gutting knife, cannery pattern, with a note the couple never showed anyone, and Lance Warden Kyrell, Captain Kyrell by then, commanded the honor guard, whose pikes the marshal of the banks personally inspected that morning, head by head, with a face that dared the bronze to be anything but whole. The vows were the old river vows, waterplane. He spoke hers holding a wrench's length of air between them until the form said otherwise. She spoke his in the field voice, and when the form said otherwise, the heir of the Tideward Crown took her engineer's scarred hands, rope burned at The closing, healed crooked at the left wrist, the realm's hands now, and everyone on the sill knew it, and pressed her palm flat against his palm, the way he had taught her to listen to a gate, skin to working surface, feeling for the true state of the thing. Whatever she felt there made the new-crowned look of her dissolve entirely one moment into the student from the dawn galleries, and the circulars could do nothing with that either. Severin recorded the marriage at the lectern they had carried down all 400 for her in the salt-set ink, and when the entry was made and witnessed, she did the last thing, the thing she had spent the winter drafting and redrafting in the lamplight of her office, with 61 years of the book spread around her. The register speaks once more, she said, and the sill went quiet. It is the office of the mistress of forms not only to keep the forms, but to keep them living, to strike what is silted and to cut new channels where the water has shown it must run. By the authority of my office, exercised once in a keepership, and not again, I enter into the book of the tideward crown a new form, to stand beside the drowning exception and the honest table and the standing order, to be read at every naming hereafter. She read it slowly, so the clerks on 3 barges could take it true, the form of the proven name. At any naming, the heir may speak any name in the realm or under contract to it, of any house or none, and the name so spoken shall be neither mocked nor struck, but proved at the same 5 stations by the same book as the name of any prince. For the register has measured the houses of blood against the houses of competence, and found that the realm floats on both, and sinks fastest where it will not look. Worth is not where a name comes from, worth is what holds when the water rises. The book is to be read accordingly, forever. The lock crews began the hauling chant before she had quite finished, which was a gross violation of the order of ceremony, and the mistress of forms ruled, from the lectern in the full voice, that the realm was singing within its rights, and the realm sang. She stayed late, after, as registrars do, packing the instruments while the barges burned their festival lamps down the reach and the court straggled gloriously up the stairs. At the edge of the sill she found the married couple where the workers find themselves at the end of any successful operation, leaning on the rail, looking at the machine. The gates of the garden lock stood open in the spring dusk far downstream. The Crown Gardens were being replanted that year, by the heir's own order, not as parterres but as flood meadow, 300 acres of working ground that would feed the city in dry years and take the river in wet ones, with the founder's 6 iron mouths kept oiled and ready at its head, and a small bronze plate on the first gate that said, simply, for the 1900, the debt is kept turning. Mistress of forms, the heir said, we never asked you. At the naming, you could have ruled the name void. Half the book argued for it. We've read it since, we know. 11 princes, the chancellor, the whole hall wanting one word from you. Why old form 9? Severin considered the question with the care it had earned. Below them the river ran dark and obedient through the works that held it, tended, every span of it, by hands that had been measured at last by what they held. Because in 61 years of keeping the rights of this realm, she said, I had watched 10,000 people say what the room required. And then a girl in a borrowed gown said a name no room on the river required, in a voice that did not shake, and a man with one mended cuff stepped out from behind the colonnade and stood by it. She closed the register, and the salt-set ink sealed another year into the book, and the mistress of forms allowed herself, on duty in public, the first entirely unprocedural smile of her keepership. I am a registrar, Highness. My whole office is one question. What is true here, and will it hold? I have failed princes who answered it badly in marble halls. I was not going to fail the only 2 people I ever met who answered it before they were asked. She bowed to them both, exactly as much as the form required, and then deliberately 1 degree more, and took up her case, and climbed the 400 steps through the lamplight to her office above the water, where the book lay open on its stand to the page the realm would be governed by now. And below her, all night, mended and proven and singing faintly through the stone, the works of the tideward crown held the river to its word, the way the truest things in any realm hold, not because they are commanded to, but because somebody competent loves them. The year turned, the water rose and was held. And in the Betrothal register of the tideward crown, where 413 names now stood in salt-set ink, the newest entry outranked them all in only one respect, noted in the margin in the mistress of form's smallest hand, for the instruction of whoever kept the book when she was gone. This one was proved.